Our speaker this evening is I think, known to many of the people in the audience. During COVID times, we had quite a good community going on Twitter, as it was, which I found particularly useful. And I discovered Jenny, if you like, from that community. She became our go-to person on the Polish armed forces in the Second World War. And that's because she is the granddaughter of serving members of General Anders' Second Corps in Italy. Really interesting family history, if you like, in that her maternal grandfather was fighting in the Polish army and was captured, was sent off as a prisoner of war. Her maternal grandmother was a teenager at that stage, and with the family were deported to Siberia. And in that brief window, when Stalin allowed the Polish POWs to be released from captivity and to make that really difficult journey through Persia, the Middle East, and into Egypt. Both of her grandparents made that journey. Her grandmother signing up to be a driver with no experience of driving, learnt to drive. The two got married shortly before moving to Italy, and their first child was born in Italy, raised behind the front lines. I find that quite amazing. And then Jenny's mother was born in England after the war, and so the story goes on. Jenny has recently edited a book published by General Majek of the Polish Armoured Division in the Northwest Europe campaign, which has been a real eye-opener for many of us who knew something about the Polish Armoured Division, but not in the detail that his memoir rolls out for us. I think that's, Jenny, I think that's more than enough for me to say by introduction. Apart from that, you are in the throes of completing your PhD, which we are all waiting to see when it comes out as a monogram, or monograph rather. But I think I will wrap up now by introducing soon to be Dr. Jenny Grant, I hope, who's going to talk to us this evening on the subject of the victory campaign, the victory parade in London in 1947. Jenny, to it.
Thanks, Dudley, for the introduction. Those of you that have sort of followed me on Twitter or sort of been to some of my talks, this is quite an interesting forum because usually I'm speaking either to a specifically British audience or Polish, and I very much changed my approach. And one of the reasons I do that is that the victory parade and so much memory associated with the Second War is just so very different depending on the national community involved. So this is going to be, I think, quite interesting, sort of bridging that gap. Victory Parade is certainly been the focus of one of the sections of my PhD. I have this crazy events management streak, and I really like to see how events are put together and staged and consideration. So it sort of ticks the box on that one. But again, it's this idea that this parade has largely fallen out of British memory almost entirely, but is such a touchstone of grievance for the Polish community. So, I mean, this photograph is really interesting. I think it's just, it's Imperial War Museum. And I was just flicking through the photographs. Obviously, these are American troops marching. But one of the interesting things you can see is actually behind them is a Polish flag. And this is a testament to the fact that until the very last minute, there was an expectation that Polish troops from Warsaw would be arriving in the glories of Croydon Airport, and they were withdrawn at the last minute. So this idea that sort of the Polish presence was inevitable just doesn't really hold water. So yeah, I'm just going to sort of talk us through the sort of the main areas tonight. There will be a sort of Polishy focus, but really what I want to be looking at is the idea of memory, how even just a year after VE Day, the memories of the war are fracturing along national lines. There's deliberate sort of construction of memory, which we'll look at, and just this idea that who was an ally and who was an enemy and who was neutral, even within sort of 1 year of the end of the conflict, just isn't as straightforward as you might imagine when you're having to deal with new geopolitical realities. So let's go through. I'm just gonna, right, sorry. Got my little registration link still up. I don't know if it can I close it? I've closed it, good, sorry. It's just blocking my little bullet point there. So key questions. First up, having a look at this distinction between the Victory Parade, how it's been remembered. We'll look at why it took place at all. There was nothing inevitable about it. It's not something that we do now. It specifically wasn't a VE Day parade. It wasn't on the anniversary of VE Day or VJ Day or anything. It was quite arbitrary. So why does the whole thing take place? We'll look at the sort of decision-making process of who to invite and the difficulties. And then we'll wrap up looking at the Polish issue. The Poles and in fact the Yugoslavs and Moscow to a certain degree were almost so problematic within the end of the war that they almost cancelled the parade entirely. So what we end up is a slightly sort of hashed compromise, which sort of really still rankles with the Poles. It was inadequately resolved. And if you look at 1985, they find a different diplomatic solution. So we certainly learn from 1946. Right. Now, one of the interesting things with the Victory Parade is, as I say, if you do a trawl through sort of British newspapers, look at the Radio Times, there's no real reference to the Victory Parade of 1946 ever after. There's lots of Victory Parade references of countries newly liberated from the British Empire, for example. Spain has a Victory Parade every few minutes, apparently. But in Britain, it just disappears. And it's really interesting because actually at the time, it was incredibly disruptive and threw up a huge amounts of material culture. So if we look on the left, you can get these on eBay for nothing these days because every single school child in Britain received this little cardboard sheet from the King commemorating victory. It talks about, I send this personal message to you and all of the boys and girls at school, for you have shared in the hardships and, sorry, I'm just trying to squint and read it, and dangers of a total war, and you have shared no less in the triumphs of the Allied nations. On the back, you then have these key war dates. And again, you look at this and just go, that's fine. But actually, there was huge amounts of discussion between the government and the King about which dates to include, which to leave out. The King, with his sort of, imperial hat on, actually suggested that more focus was given to Australian events than was originally on there. And then at the bottom, we've got a little space for my family's war record, with an appreciation that each family experienced the war differently. So this is something that was a national piece of paper. And you also have sort of programs, official, unofficial. At Croydon, all the citizens get this little medal to commemorate it. You have stamps issued throughout the empire. And obviously, if you're trying to organise a parade through central London over into East London, it's hugely disruptive. So you get sort of all these pamphlets about how the event will impact transport arrangements around London. But as I say, the British, it's just not there. It hasn't had that foothold that VE Day does with the parties and the sort of drunken soldiers and so forth. The Poles have remembered it, but in many ways they have misremembered parts of it, partly because it was slightly arbitrary. So, for example, 1961, General Kapansky of the Carpathian Brigade writes, on May the 8th, 1946, a great parade took place in London on the anniversary of the victory. It actually took place on June the 8th. So the date's wrong, it's not on the anniversary. Lech Wałęsa in 1995, when on the 9th of May 1945, so he's thinking it's VE Day, the victory parade took place in London, the Poles were missing from there. So even though it's a source of grievance, there's still quite a lot of misconception, misunderstanding within elements of the Polish community. Now, one of the reasons for that is partly because the date that is decided is completely arbitrary. And the reason it's completely arbitrary is because the government doesn't actually want it. A little bit like in 1985 when Thatcher doesn't want a VE Day commemoration. She's worried it will be triumphalist, that it will alienate West Germany, that Moscow will exploit it in some way and so forth. It was easier again in 1946 to not have a victory parade. That would have been the government's preference. But there is popular expectation. So brief timeline then, it's all resolved very quickly within sort of 6 months. October, the first questions are raised of will there be victory celebrations, as there had been in 1919. November 1945, they actually go, oh, fine, right. So a committee of ministers. Remember, this is November of 1945. Britain's got lots more problems to be dealing with, but all of the senior ministers work together to form a committee. And then what we have over December, February is sort of discussions on the rationale, getting political approval, the logistics, bringing in the army and so forth. And crucially, with Foreign Office consulting on the guest list, who are we actually going to invite? And we get to March 1946, and the embassies are instructed to issue invitations that each of the allied nations send a contingent. You have the big four, which includes sort of China and France and so forth, can send a contingent that's 3 times bigger. And then the smaller countries can send a smaller contingent so that it fits, so that you're marching 12 abreast. And the idea was that ideally that would represent the 3 services, but you could send representatives from resistance movements, you could send representatives from women's auxiliary services and so forth. So there's no real sort of direction given on that one. And then March 1946 to June 1946, you've got sort of final planning. This is where the Poles kind of realise that they're not invited. And then June 1946 is where the parade actually takes place. One of the key points then is that the date that they decide on is so arbitrary that the Soviets think they are being tricked into attending. What they're trying to calculate is you need enough time, obviously, to put all of this planning in place. In July, they're going to start introducing bread rationing. So ideally, we're introducing something before then, but our primary consideration is not to introduce productivity. So they basically harness it to the sort of wit weekend, effectively, which means that it's not really on any significant date, which I think is probably part of the reason why it's not stayed in the memory. They sort of rewrite history a little bit. They bring in a flag from D-Day. They say it's very close to the 6th of June, but that was a little bit sort of post facto. So one of the first considerations was, should it take place at all? So this is our Labour government faced with, you know, an empire that's going to be collapsing soon. We've got austerity, we've got mass homelessness, we've still got thousands of troops overseas. Arguments against are pretty compelling. First up, across Britain, we've got a relatively poor standard of living. We have rationing, we have homelessness. We've got lots of people either sharing homes with family, or going and squatting in sort of Nissan huts that have been vacated and so forth. So in that sense, what is there to celebrate already? You've also got the fact that this is a major event. It will require resources being diverted from reconstruction. So, for example, bomb sites were being cleared, houses were being rebuilt. Instead, what we're doing is sort of repainting lampposts. We're taking down air raid shelters and so forth. So that was a significant consideration. It felt quite a flippant thing to be doing. And you've also got the issue of demobilisation. Actually, we're going to really struggle to find a lot of the service personnel. So a lot of the troops from various national contingents that march have actually been released from sort of German POW camps. So they're actually already in Europe rather than being sent from overseas. But the arguments for were, number one, this is Labour government, the newly elected. There is a broad popular expectation, a sort of tide of expectation that the parade will take place. The second consideration, and this is explicit in the notes, is that the USA and USSR were already beginning to change the narrative. And you'll know about the Operation Burma film, for example, which sort of erases the British presence in Burma, for example. So in this sense, they talk about the parade providing some much needed publicity to the part played by British and imperial troops. So we're sort of propping up this idea that Britain had been in fighting from the beginning-ish, and the empire as well. That this, you know, it's a hope that this would knit together the empire. So in that sense, it's then only third consideration is that this is an idea of honouring the part played by the people of the Commonwealth and increasingly all the different sort of auxiliary and voluntary societies and so forth. Another interesting thing, and I found this when we were looking at VE Day today this year, where people were sort of co-opting the poppy, is the ability to sort of separate this sort of celebration element from the commemorative. So there was talk that actually within the marching contingent there would just be a gap, and that would represent the men and women who had fallen. But they decided that was not in line with the actual event itself. But a lot of the official programs, sorry, unofficial programs, have all the official details, but on the back they would have a reference to Lest We Forget or some sort of reference to poppies and so forth. So these things sort of take on a sort of life and significance of their own. So just not, I don't want to get sort of too academic on this, but any event like this is in itself not inevitable. I think the British are very, very good at very sort of slick framing of events that seem very traditional, but have all been put together very carefully. And one of the things that has to be done is anticipating popular expectations. That shapes it significantly. If the, you know, we'll know if the BBC commentators aren't sufficiently reverent or well versed, that will be commented on. If uniform is sloppy at any point, this will be commented on. So you're always having to meet this expectation that is not necessarily spoken before the event, but certainly will lead to criticism afterwards. You're trying at the same time to bring a nation together, but in a way that sort of mirrors its self-perception and enhances that. You'll also obviously be looking back to precedent. How has the staging been done in the past? When do we do this? What went wrong? It will also obviously be shaped by specifically why are we doing this now and what are we commemorating now? And you're also going to have an eye, because that guest list is all important. This is a chance to make or break diplomatic relations. And we are at this point in the sort of the foothills of the Cold War. This is after the Iron Curtain speech. And then, and this is the bit that I really enjoy, is the practicalities. You have to look at the calendar, you look at the commemorative calendar. Where can we actually slot this? What dates are inappropriate? When will the king be available? How do we get here? How much notice can people have? What will the weather be like? How will transport be affected? So all of these will have a surprising impact and sort of shaping the overall thing. There's only so long people can actually stand and watch something for. So this idea that sort of victory and commemoration and parades shift in meaning and their shape, it's fascinating. So 1919, for example, there's a quote from the Victory Parade, which was sort of designed to coincide with both Peace Day. I love Peace Day. It's got that sort of Simpsons-esque element. So we had widespread rioting about unemployment and living conditions after the war. So we introduced Peace Day. And it also coincided with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. So this is an extract from a newspaper from a group that was not invited. It says, "We were fit to assist in breaking the aggression of Germany, but we were not fit to be in the Victory March. We live and learn." Now, I was chatting with Dudley earlier, and there's the option of doing a poll, and I suddenly thought, actually, we could do that. Anybody wants to jump in the chat and sort of suggest which country the writer is from, that will, can I give you a 30-second window? I will do that. Okay. "We were fit to assist in breaking the aggression of Germany, but we were not fit to be in the Victory March. We live and learn." silent chat. Is that there? Okay, it's killing me. It's Nigeria. Black troops were not allowed to march in the 1919 parade. Initially, there were supposed to be no troops from the empire at all. Canada was a very late suggestion. India came, but I think they were held up by food poisoning or transport or something. For whatever reason, the Indian troops went there, but the black troops were never going to be invited. So there's definite parallels with sort of the Nigerian attitude and then the Polish attitude sort of 30 years on. 1985, we've got the challenge. It is right to emphasize the reconciliation that has taken place between ourselves and nations that were our traditional enemies in Europe. This is the idea that actually they invite any country that had an embassy in London was invited to the VE Day celebrations in 1985 to avoid all reference to who was an ally, who was not an ally, and so forth. And then 2025 VE Day was absolutely fascinating. So the top, you've got the Polish troops are there as representatives of NATO, which obviously is an organization that didn't exist in the Second World War, but now this is sort of shoring up that alliance. So you can see the sort of the diplomatic pull of this. Interestingly, obviously, within that NATO contingent, you have German troops. So we had German troops marching through London for supposedly VE Day, which I find absolutely fascinating. And then obviously we have the Ukrainian troops. Now, let's not get into Ukraine and the Second War, but Poles will avoid this one. But the idea that, again, that it's been used as a tribute to a nod to who we value these days is incredibly significant. But in the first place, there was a big debate on whether we should invite NA allies at all. And I've kind of hinted at a few reasons why we might be reluctant to invite any. First one is, if we're trying to celebrate the role of Britain and its empire, which we said was one of the founding principles of this, it would undermine the focus if we said, but actually look at all our other allies and bring in France, we bring in America, we bring in the USSR, and so forth. Maybe we just invite the major nations. This was the next one. So USA, France, China, USSR. And that would be, you know, we don't really need Sweden, do we? I don't know. So that's a possibility. And at this point, they sort of panic a little bit and look at what they did in 1919. 1919 is actually really interesting because we invited loads of people, and we had, I think, SAHR, we had Poland was represented in 1919. So we go, oh, damn it, I guess we have to invite everybody. But then there's concern about the logistics, like, you know, shipping is at a premium for returning POWs, bringing home sort of troops from abroad and so forth. So we're going to have to divert that. We've got, where the hell do these guys stay? We can't exactly put them all up at the Dorchester. London is bombed out, and this is difficulty. And one of the issues is because we've had the Treaty of Versailles, we've had the breakdown of the European empires, there are actually many more countries with a claim to be in an alliance with us than there had been in 1919. So then there's a practical issue of how long can you expect people to stand there and watch a parade go through if you've invited half the world? And that brings us to the really interesting part, which I want to focus on, which is who actually constitutes an ally. In the middle of all this, just to complicate matters, the Air Ministry actually sort of intervenes, and they say, if we're not inviting these allies, could we at least have an international contingent with the RAF? And they say this will serve as an education for them as well as for our own people. So in the end, they invite the Battle of Britain Polish pilots. They were pretty much always going to be invited. They sort of check with Warsaw, but then they sort of issue an invitation earlier, and that's going to sort of cause some problems later down the line. So in the end, the Foreign Office agrees that they should invite all the nations that they describe as fellow forgers of victory. But what we're talking about then is, what is an ally? Is it somebody with whom you have had a formal treaty of alliance, somebody that you have fought alongside? Is it somebody who has helped you out in some way? So we begin to look at, for example, what about the Portuguese? So they talk about, for example, the Persians. We invade Persia and then use it as a sort of major logistical route to supply Stalin. And they say, you know, I'm not very clear myself just what facilities the Persians did afford us, and the Russians, no doubt they were appreciable. And then they say, but what about the Portuguese? And they were supposedly neutral, but they offered use of the Azores, for example, which was a really significant sort of staging post for then transporting material onwards. And if we do that, what about Italy's a really interesting one. Obviously, start of the war, we're pretty clear Mussolini is formally part of the Axis, does the usual thing of joining in late. But for a year and a half, the king has been leading the war in alliance with the Western allies. But would that be a step too far? So that's kind of dealing with the past. And then you've got to sort of look into the future. Denmark, for example, it has its own SS unit. It definitely has its own sort of quisling government, but they are a country with whom we have very good traditional sort of diplomatic trading links and so forth. So we basically try to find a reason to include them. So we talked about, let's focus on their sort of resistance movement and their merchant navy. And then they're saying, actually, if Denmark were left out, could we really go and include Norway or Ethiopia and Mexico? So all of this had the potential to really offend. And what you see is very much a sense that remembering the war too accurately is actually a disadvantage, even a year after the end of the war. Now, the Polish problem is pretty specific, more so than the Yugoslavs. We do have sort of a few sort of Yugoslav presence in Britain during the war, but the Poles have been the largest sort of exiled European group from the beginning, really. What happens is, in order to normalize the situation in Eastern Europe, is at the end of the war, Britain transfers its recognition from the London government in exile to the provisional government in Warsaw, on the basis that Stalin had promised there would be free and fair elections. And there's a huge debate in London about how far they should work with Warsaw and so forth to kind of reunite the Polish people and the Polish war effort. And lots of people call it wrong. And the victory parade basically falls within this gap of who do we recognize, who do we acknowledge? Because obviously Warsaw has never been formally allied. Certainly the Poles have contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany to a significant degree. There were Polish troops in Berlin when it was liberated, for example. But that doesn't really have much cut through in Britain. So within this confusion, obviously, we have the fact of Yalta. We sort of side with Warsaw Poles in that sense. In terms of the sort of the London Poles, as we'll call them, there's an appreciation that many of them won't go home. So we established the Polish Resettlement Corps for those that remain, which is about 50% of the Poles in the West. And then you've got still within this sort of space a lot of confusion. When the United Nations first meets, there is an empty chair for Poland because they're not quite sure who to invite. Imperial War Graves Commission is about to have its third inter-allied conference and doesn't know who to invite, so they actually scrap it. So you can see that within this sort of year, there's a huge amount of confusion about which Poles own the Polish war effort effectively. Now I'm just going to go through Foreign Office options. I'll sort of race through this a little bit because I think what we're talking about is, by the time we get to the victory parade, it's probably best to imagine it as your parents having recently divorced on very, very terrible grounds. Maybe one of them was caught cheating at a Coldplay concert, for example, and they just won't be in the same room with each other. Okay, it's completely acrimonious, but they are united by the fact of you. So the Foreign Office options are either they invite both Warsaw and London and they march together as one, but both of them make it very clear they will not show up if the other one's there. So that's out. You could invite them both, but have them march as two separate contingents, so seat them on other sides of the room. But that again, you're still acknowledging the legitimacy of the other, so that was out. You could invite just the London Poles, the Poles in the West. It would have the advantage of honouring the alliance and contribution, but it would be diplomatically disastrous in that you're just turning your back on Warsaw, who you've just recognised. Which leaves you with the final option, which is you invite just the Warsaw Poles, which they freely admit is going to be hugely offensive to the London Poles, the Poles in the West, but it is diplomatically safe. It does mean there will be a Polish presence, and there is a hope that this will be the new Polish government. They will show up and be the legitimate Polish government, and that will sort of tie things together nicely. So that's the option they go for, just invite the Warsaw Poles. And they talk through all of these options very logically. They say, no doubt in a perfect world, the second category Poles, the London Poles, would have a far better claim to participate in the victory celebrations. But as it is, we are bound to invite the Polish government to send a contingent. And they basically say it would be lovely if they sort of reached out to the London Poles and asked them to contribute a contingent. They could have done, but they're clearly not going to do that. So that was the situation as it stood. Now in Warsaw, to begin with, there's huge actual diplomatic value to them sending a contingent, and it looks as if they will actually attend the London event. They certainly send through names of senior officers that have quite big sort of PR purposes. So, for example, General Paskiewicz had commanded the brigade up in Scotland, for example. He's very, very well known in Scotland. He's met Churchill, he's met the King, and so forth. So he's a bit of a sort of establishment figure. For example, Commodore Janiszewicz hadn't yet actually left England, but they think he will, and he'd been there at D-Day and so forth. But they're trying all the time to work out basically what will Yugoslavia and USSR do. They write to both of them saying, what are you doing? And they're always trying to sort of sound out whether there will be anybody from the West. They try to ensure that the Battle of Britain Airmen will be excluded explicitly. And the UK just begins to lose patience. It says, like, we've bent over backwards. We've said no other contingent representing the Polish army will take part in the march, but the exclusion of the airmen would be nothing but a national insult to Poland. So they're saying, this is our line in the sand. The airmen have this particular privileged position. We have given you everything, but we can't give you this. So in the final weeks, London is basically ready to receive the Polish contingent from Warsaw and have the airmen. If you look in the sort of order of the march, that the Poles are up there between Norway and, where are we? Gosh, my eyesight's terrible, Transjordan and so forth. The Polish ambassador and Polish military attaché are both expecting the Warsaw contingent. They go to Croydon Airport expecting them to arrive. So until the very last minute, we are expecting Warsaw to send a representative. We've got tents set aside for them. We've got a suite in the Dorchester and so forth. May 1946, then, what we realise, obviously you don't know you've not been invited to an event until you speak to other people and find out you've not been invited. And the Polish Army, Polish Navy realise they've not been invited. This leads to a massive media campaign in the newspapers full of sort of Polish sympathisers, most of them quite sort of well connected. And at the same time, Warsaw begins to fall silent. There's a little bit from a newspaper here. Is it too late to hope that common sense will yet prevail over a too rigid adherence to etiquette, and that an invitation will be sent through one of the Polish generals who fought for Poland's liberty to those Poles whom we admire for the part they play. Foreign Office, it's in hell at this point. They have to work on the assumption that Warsaw will be coming. They've not heard anything to the contrary, so they have to continue to defend their current policy. But in the background, they have a backup plan. They don't actually tell the minister this. They begin to sound out Polish generals to march with them, but they will march with the British rather than as a Polish contingent, so they won't represent Poland per se. And basically they'll have to back down if Warsaw does arrive. So it's a pretty shonky last-minute offer. The London Poles, in response, the generals effectively get together and they decline this invitation. The official grounds, they say, and I love the snarky nature of this, is they hadn't had time to rehearse the route. They hadn't been left with enough time to rehearse the route. Interesting element, though, is actually for most of the Poles in Italy, the victory parade wasn't a thing. It doesn't even appear in the newspapers at the time. They're very much focused on what are the terms of the Polish resettlement core, what will their new life in Britain look like. Victory parade is a local thing in Britain. Dziennik Polski, which is obviously based in the UK, is full of it. Admiral Siersky says, he wants his troops to be acknowledged. They will take part in a local parade. At Portsmouth, he's happy for the ships to be open. He wants us to be acknowledged as an ally. He says we can't participate in expressions of joy. This is not a victory. And that's really, I think, sort of significant aspect of how the Poles perceive this. It's really been sort of lost through time. Advisable Ejitsky says at the last minute he withdraws the Polish airman. He says, I feel sure you will understand the very difficult and awkward position in which I find myself now, when the other services of the Polish Armed Forces, which are also under British command, have not been invited, and when at the same time representatives will take part. Churchill obviously is now in opposition. He stands up a couple of days before the parade. I deeply regret that none of the Polish troops who fought with us on a score of battlefields, who poured out their blood in the common cause, are to be allowed to march in the victory parade. They will be in our thoughts on that day. We shall never forget their bravery and martial skill associated with our own glories at Tobruk, at Cassino, and at Arnhem. Now, I'm not going to go into Warsaw's withdrawal massively. All that happens is there is an assumption in the Foreign Office that they have pulled out due to Russian orders, and that there's no smoking gun, but the assumption is that they've been lent on. The official reason they give is that we'd allowed General Komorowski a passport to allow him to go to Chicago and give speeches there that were pretty anti-communist, but even the Polish ambassador's like, that's really lame, guys, come on. So effectively they say, I don't know why Warsaw Poles have refused unless it is Russian orders. They will send us an abusive note. I expect they are expert muckslingers. So what's the outcome? There's a sort of final sad note in the Foreign Office files that basically sort of a day before saying there will be no Poles of any kind in the parade now. Dziennik Polski responds as Poles can. Some people thought the whole could be patched with the leper Polish army from Cassino and Falaise. But ultimately a Polish soldier, even though he wears an English uniform, is not a poor relative who is invited to the table only when there is an empty seat left by someone who did not accept the invitation. And this is the Polish ambassador, Henryk Strasburger, sends this furious letter, 4 pages of just, you guys are so incompetent, back to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He says the emigre press now feel fully vindicated in their criticism of Warsaw. You have blown it. These guys were debating whether to come back to Poland or not, and you look like barbarians. This is so discourteous. And increasingly, they say the emigre press is using the language, the rhetoric of the partitions. They liken Poland to Lazarus. You know, when the Poles bring out their sort of big Polish metaphors, you have lost them. They're now awaiting resurrection after the Third World War. This is a huge schism, the eyes of Strasburger, possibly overestimating the impact of the victory parade, even in sort of the Polish forces and sort of Germany and so forth, certainly not in Italy. But it becomes this sort of cornerstone of sort of grievance after sort of Katyn and Yalta. Right, I am going to leave it there, if that's all right. Thank you for bearing with me through this sort of gallop. And here we go.
I have the joy of living in Newark, close to the Polish cemetery, and I'm always struck by some of the graves which are there, and particularly the empty graves as they are now, or many of them are, because Sikorski was buried in Newark, and I think it was 4 presidents in exile were buried there, some of whom have been reinterred in Poland. But I knew nothing about this Polish government in exile, which existed way into late 20th century. Yeah, we're aware of governments in exile during wartime, but of course now that Poland sits behind an iron curtain, or always sitting behind or due to be sitting behind an iron curtain, I think not many people understand why this Polish government in exile lingers on. And you refer to them as the Polish or the London Poles. Is it a big constituency? Where's the legitimacy come from, and how do they feel it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult one, because what happens with when the British transfer recognition to Warsaw is they then take the Polish armed forces in the West under British command. That's the only way that they can sort of systematically, structurally handle that. So the Polish government exile becomes relatively toothless. It is largely symbolic. It lobbies to a degree, but really the veterans associations and so forth are going to become a much more sort of powerful group, probably a more meaningful element. Some people sort of correct me, but those are the groups that tend to be the ones that, like the Great Imperial War Graves Commission will liaise with, and so forth. I've lost my train of thought somewhat. So yes, that was one of the considerations when they're trying to invite the Poles in the West. They don't go to the Polish government in exile. They go directly to the generals, to the admirals, and so forth, because they've sort of been sidelined. There's a really interesting point. President Raczkiewicz will die the following year, and the Foreign Office is very, very conscious of trying not to offend the Poles again. So they go all out to sort of honour him. But just a month before he died, they were actually looking into what legal recourse they had to basically stop him calling himself the president of the government in exile. Warsaw and Moscow were sending all these complaints saying, can you shut him up? And they were like, well, it is a diplomatic glitch. How can we iron this out? So they were talking about, well, maybe we could sort of withdraw funding for him. They came down to maybe we could deport him to Ireland. That would be great. And in the end, they come up with a very British rationale, which is actually we're British. We have no legal recourse to stop somebody calling themselves whatever they want to. But you will then find this sort of policy line that's followed, which is whenever the British government is commemorating Polish war dead, you know, when General Kukiel dies or Bukonowski, they have to stress to Warsaw that they are honouring him as a military ally and not recognising his later political role within the government in exile and so forth. So you see for the next sort of 40 years, the sort of British government, British establishment having to sort of tread that line between the military and political.
Not helped by the fact that they keep electing new presidents in exile. How does that happen?
I mean, I don't want to offend anybody, but the Poles are a relatively sort of fractious nation, and then there's a sort of splinter group formed, and so forth. So let's not get into yes, there's relatively rapid turnover at key points.
Yeah. Yes. All right. I'll let you off the hook there, Jenny. there are questions in the audience, and I just put the first one up. And it refers back to 1919 because you were making the comparisons. And Paul has asked, do we know if there were similar convoluted machinations and considerations surrounding the 1919 parade?
Yeah, and I don't know so much about the practicalities of it, but there was certainly this consideration, which I think I sort of referenced a little bit, of who to include in this. So, for example, the French were always front and center. They were always going to invite the French, but they never really, in contrast to sort of 1945, we'd see sort of 1919 as peak of the empire, but we didn't want to include any empire troops at all. And then they're sort of persuaded within sort of government discussions to bring in, as I say, the white troops. And then they stretch to India because India is significant. But then, so you've kind of got this sort of clear racial hierarchy playing out. So that was the consideration in 1919. As I say, in terms of the actual sort of the timings beyond that, I don't know. But yeah, you've got all manner of sort of, say, you've got Polish troops, you've got troops from Siam, you've got all these new countries that have emerged from the Treaty of Versailles are then sort of represented, which is kind of lovely. So the Poles make it to 1919, just 1946.
Thank you. Andrew has asked, were there any references to a Czech contingent in the march, or were they also excluded?
So at the time, no, the Czechs arrive, and actually the Czechs are really helpful as a way of comparing how fully committed the Warsaw Poles were, because the Czechs, they're not yet under communist control. That's going to be 47 when Mazaryk's dispatched and so forth. So they're asking really practical questions like, where can we change our money, for example, and where will we be staying? And the Poles never get to that level of detail that you would be wanting were you to be sending this contingent over. So yes, no, the Czechs are very much there.
Mark has asked, in media discussions of the time about the absence of Poland from the parade, does anyone bring up Britain's decision to go to war in 1939 to defend Poland and the symbolic element therein of Poland's absence? Betrayal of the initial reasoning for entering the war, sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, you would have thought there would, but in 1946 and actually ever after, whenever the Brits are seen as sort of letting down the Poles and commemoration and so forth, it's actually focused much more on the Polish contribution than this idea. You see it referenced occasionally. There's politicians sort of 1984, 1985 is like, after all, we did go to war for these guys and we failed, but maybe we can make it up a little way. But it's very much focused much more on Poland's military contribution. We'll talk about, you know, the big few, the sort of Tobruk casino, fillets. Yeah, so you'd have thought it would be a bigger deal, but yeah, I think partly because the idea that the phony war is so set in people's sort of imagination, even though obviously the Navy's very active from sort of day one. So I think almost that rationale has died down over time.
We've majored a lot on obviously the Polish dilemma, but I was really fascinated by just your identifying the practical considerations regarding a victory march or parade rather through London post-war. Now, I grew up in London in the early 60s and I was still playing on bomb sites. I know that the recovery took much longer than people will care to remember. But the parade route, could you go into a bit more about the length of it? And I mean, we've been reminded recently about Washington's, the mayor of Washington not wishing to have a parade through his city just because of the damage that it might cause. So what was the Greater London Council's view of all this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting one because the King plays a really active role in the decision making. So they decided the route, because obviously we're sort of writing up the People's War idea. So the route actually takes in far more of the East End than it traditionally would, in sort of homage to the fact, we don't know, to honour the sacrifices borne by those living in the Docklands, which were so heavily targeted. So that was one element. The King obviously is aware of his popularity and, you know, obviously it's not an ego thing if you're the king, but he's aware of his significance to much of the British people. So he insists on having a sort of open carriage for a lot of it, so that, you know, the people will see him much more. And one of my favourite facts is the fact that they have to go through the route and basically destroy lots of traffic islands so that the tanks won't get caught up on it. There was a preview, I think the night before, and they basically, it's what happens if, you know, like we've got this V2 rocket on a trailer, what happens if it breaks down, and like, we're just going to have to go around it. There is nothing we can do. If that happens, it happens. It's just, so that's one element. They also, they do try to take down a lot of the air raid shelters as a sort of symbolic. So there's quite a few around Trafalgar Square that are removed sort of to boost the aesthetic of it. But yes, you've got, I mean, one of the interesting things is you've got people coming from all around Britain to this event, and they don't know about things like the availability of food, which pre-war would have not been an issue. Obviously, you could just go to the bakery and pick up a sandwich. So there's one woman that travels in and she's brought a trifle with her. You've got a bunch of sort of teenagers from Hull that come and then they sort of sleep on the platforms because you did that, because, you know, there's quite a few sailors, in order to get a really good view of the parade, actually sling hammocks between lampposts along the route and so forth. So you've got all these different sort of travel, sleeping, food arrangements being sort of adopted unilaterally.
Yeah, it is the practicalities, isn't it, that would stymie people. We can see footage of the 1919 parade. I don't think I've ever seen anything of the 1946 parade. Is there Pathy News type coverage that we could find?
There is, yeah. There's, I think if you just type in 1946 parade, there's also, there was it was filmed, that the parade was filmed. The idea was that the Dimbleby would actually fly over the parade and give sort of commentary, but in the end there was too many clouds and so forth. So it was filmed, and then you could go to the cinema for weeks afterwards and watch the colour film of the event. So if you're really interested, there's loads of copies. It's sort of thing you get in like garden centre video sections, where it's V-Day and I think it's the victory celebrations or victory parade. So you can get colour copies of what was shown in cinemas afterwards, readily available. Yeah.
And your certificates to the schools, once again, something I'd never heard of before. And you say they're freely available on eBay.
Yeah, because every child has got them, but it's the sort of thing that's clearly been stashed away, and now people are sort of clearing out Granny's attic and so forth. So they're then being sort of re-released. So there's loads of programs. There's loads of these. Yeah, they're sort of the King's message. Yes.
Jenny, if you open up the chat, you'll see that people are saying what a fascinating talk this has been this evening, and I echo that. I think that it meets all the requirements of a Society of Army Historical Research talk, because it rages quite a lot on the British Army, but it's the political and the diplomatic dimension which I think you brought out extremely well this evening. It's been great. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to draw stumps now, but just to say on behalf of the Society, Jenny, we are grateful for A, for you volunteering to do this, and B, for delivering such a wonderful talk this evening. And good luck with writing up your PhD.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to sneak the polls in as well. It's good.
Good. All right. Good night, everybody. Hopefully we'll see you all again on the 13th of August.